If you felt like the Cubs were the victims of bad umpiring in this last week and it affected the games, then you might be onto something. Let's put some facts behind those feelings and let's talk about some solutions for the next couple of years for Rob Manfred and the MLB. All right, Cubs fans, I am coming to you with some bad news. Cubs went 2-4 this week in a week that they had to have had a winning record. We've said it last week. If they went 3-3 or had a losing record, this was going to put them in a Mount Everest climbing over Mount Everest kind of situation. And that's exactly what's happened. Instead of being 3.5 games out, they're now 5.5 games out with 37 left to play. That's huge. That feels insurmountable, if I'm being completely honest. Now, you can talk all day long about they have a really easy schedule coming up. I don't care if it's easy or not. 5.5 games with 37 left to play is extremely difficult. I've seen crazier things, but right now it's going to be tough. So we're going to talk about the umpiring situation today. Speaking of which, I've got a video coming out on Thursday of why Seiya Suzuki is always getting screwed on called third strikes, first strikes, second strikes, just strikes in general. So we're going to take a look at that and my not experience, but just kind of looking through the lens of watching a lot of game film, why Seiya might be having that happen to him. You may have also seen that The Athletic had an article about this earlier this week. I was already planning on doing something like this in the off season, but that just kind of got me saying, all right, well, people are talking about, let's go ahead and do a video about it. So I'm going to be doing that later this week. When I talk about this, I'm really thinking about two key moments here in this last week. Number one was a called third strike that was not called in the bottom of the fourth inning against Josh Naylor with Shota Imanaga on the mound. That would have been the third out of the inning, but of course the Guardians go on to score 4 runs that inning, and the Cubs end up losing that game by 1 run. Had you got a third called strike right there and a third out in the inning, I don't think there's any doubt that the Cubs go on to win that game. That's where the momentum was. It was a complete momentum shifter as soon as Naylor was able to get a base hit, followed by a 3-run home run by Noel. Then you've got, in Sunday's game, a called first strike to Dansby Swanson in the fourth inning. Cubs down by 1, bases loaded after a few really bad breaks for the Blue Jays. The momentum was on the Cubs side. It would have been ball 2 and 2-0 with 2 outs and the bases loaded Dansby Swanson. It was a horrible called strike, and it completely shifted the at-bat. And the third called strike of the at-bat was an extremely borderline pitch as well, and a great opportunity for Jim Wolf to make up for a call that he had missed early in the at-bat. But, of course, it goes the Blue Jays' way. Swanson strikes out looking. Had that at-bat gone differently, I'm not saying a guarantee that the Cubs would have gotten a run, but if he could have at least coaxed a walk, got a base hit, you're looking at least a tie game going into the 10th inning. Cubs can potentially win that game. I think you're looking. I don't know if Statcast does this, that it's a pitch by pitch situation. I do know it's an out by out situation that you can see win probability. But I'm willing to bet had that gone 2-0 instead of 1-1, you probably have a much higher probability of the Cubs winning that game. And for that reason, had those 2 calls gone the Cubs' way, you're potentially looking at 2 wins and a 4-2 week instead of a 2-4 week. But at the very least, a 3-3 week and 4.5 games behind in the wild card, which is still not great but manageable. But man, those 2 calls were the difference makers in those games and potentially in the week. Now, a lot of you can go on here and you can say, well, the Cubs should have just scored more runs. They should have played better. Yes, absolutely. But here's the frustration, right, is that this week especially was incredibly glaring how much of a role umpires played in the decision of games. And that should not be happening. So let's talk about this for a second. August 12th through the 18th, here's the numbers. I'm going to rattle off some numbers. By the way, if you're listening on the podcast, make sure that you watch on the YouTube channel, because as you are watching, I'm going to do a split screen here. You're going to see 5 different types of pitches that are going on during these games that were missed calls. I'm calling the first set Little League strikes, where essentially, with the Little League World Series about to start and going on right now, you're seeing a lot of balls that were on the corners that were definitely not strikes, but were called strikes. And they're, as JD and Boog would say, they were egregious calls. I'm calling them Little League calls instead of egregious. And then that's on both sides. I'm doing this on both sides, guys. I'm not trying to be just Cubs biased. So Little League strikes, they go against the Cubs. Little league strikes that are in favor of the Cubs, you'll see that category is a lot smaller. Then I'm just going missed strikes against Cubs pitchers. So if it was obviously in the strike zone, if the full ball was in the strike zone, then and it was not called a strike, that's the third category. And then missed strikes in favor of the Cubs. So if an opponent like the Guardians or the Blue Jays threw a ball that was in the strike zone and it was called a ball, that's the last one. And then just kind of borderline strikes against the Cubs that should not have been strikes, but they were close enough that you don't really call those egregious. So those are the 5 categories. Make sure you're watching on the YouTube channel. I really encourage you to do that. Now, there were 79 total pitches, according to StatCast on Baseball Savant, 79 total pitches in the 6 games that were called incorrectly, either balls being called strikes or strikes being called balls. That's 13.2 per game. In the previous 119 games this season, there were 11.8 incorrect calls per game in Cubs games. 13.2 in the last 6, 11.8 in the previous 119. A pretty big difference. 33 of these balls that were called strikes were against the Cubs. 33. Only 16 balls that were balls and were called strikes were for the Cubs. So literally, umpires, home plate umpires, doubled the amount of calls in favor of opponents for balls to strikes against the Cubs. That's how bad this was. Then, strikes that were in the strike zone, but they were called balls, 14 in favor of the Cubs, 16 in favor against the Cubs and in favor of the opponents. So, in summary, there were, again, 79 total pitches that were called incorrectly, 49 of them in favor of opponents, 30 in favor of the Cubs. 19 more calls in 6 games were in favor of opponents compared to the Cubs. Again, this is all StatCast. This is not me going and watching every single pitch. This is me going on and checking out what was a ball, according to StatCast, that was called a strike, and what was a strike that was called a ball. All of this is on StatCast. Now, for the year, for a lot of you, I posted this on Twitter, and a lot of you were like, well, it's been happening all year. I wanted to back that up with some stats. So for the year, that's actually not the case. The Cubs have been in favor. They have been the recipients of some bad umpiring for the first 119 games of the year leading into this last week. There were 673 calls that were in favor of opponents and 735 calls that were in favor of the Cubs. So basically 62 more calls in favor of the Cubs in the first 119 games. Yes, I went through and I looked at a lot of stats here. So this is, just so you know, I did about 2-3 hours of research before I pressed the record button on this podcast and this video right now. So that's all to say that this last week was glaringly different for the Cubs and glaringly in favor of the opponents. And that during a time when this team going into the week is in striking distance of a wild card spot is just not acceptable. It should not be acceptable from the league. This is not fun either way, just to be completely clear. There was a couple that, if you are watching this on YouTube, you'll see there's a couple strikes that were not called strikes in the Cubs' favor in Game 2 against the Guardians. When that happened, I kind of thought to myself, like, well, maybe this is baseball evening itself out, but, like, that also doesn't feel great. Like, I don't like when my team goes and gets a couple runs because an umpire messed up. I don't have fun with that. I don't feel like that's a true, like, moral victory. That just is a victory on paper. I don't know about you guys. Let me know in the comments. If a call is made in the favor of the Cubs that is obviously wrong as a ball or strike, do you feel good about that? Does that, like, are you like, yeah, well, yeah, thank you, umpire? Or are you like, man, umpiring sucks, but we got away with one? Let me know in the comments. I want to know. And, the thing is, guys, umpires are human. This is a incredibly difficult job, whether you're behind home plate, at first base, second base, third base, no matter where you're at. This is an incredibly difficult job. I know this because firsthand, I went through umpiring school. It was just kind of a fun thing for me when I was in my early 20s, thought I might go and do it Little League. As soon as I got behind the plate to call strikes it was just like pitching machine. It wasn't a real game. I was like, screw this, I'm out. Like, I could not tell the difference. It is an incredibly difficult job. And so you can't be mad at umpires. They are trying to do their best job. I don't care if you like CB Buckner or not, or Angel Hernandez or not, or any of these guys. Their job is on the line if they're not doing a good job, right? It's not on the line enough. They should be held more accountable. But no umpire is going out there and being like, yeah, I want to do a really bad job today. So I give them that, but I also want to talk about, if that's not the case, if we can't change this with a challenge system, then what are the solutions? Because here's the deal. Rob Manfred is saying that now it's possible, quote unquote, that the league will try out the ABS system, automated ball strike system, which they've been testing out in the minors for the last couple of years, in 2026. And going deeper into that, they want to try it out in spring training in 2025. In my opinion, that's just not really fast enough. And guys, like, just so everyone knows, I'm not all for like, hey, let's just have robo umpires and let's just have lasers at home plate and no one is even there, and lasers at first base and third base and no human interaction of umpires. I'm not for that. I don't think that that's effective. I think we've already lost a huge entertainment factor of the game in there being a lot less tosses. There's been a lot less of, arguments with the coaches and the umpires and the players and the umpires. And a lot of that has been gone. And, if you're like, well, I don't watch baseball for that, that's fine. But let's be honest. People who go to hockey games, they get excited about the fights, right? And that kind of pulls them in. If you want new talent, if you want new fans, if you want new exciting things in this game, you have to be looking at what do non-fans want to see. And I actually heard a conversation from Jimmy at John Boy the other day. It was really good. He was like, hey, I brought these people to a Yankees and Red Sox game, and it was a nail-biter pitching duel to the end of the game. And I'm sitting on the edge of my seat, just like, what a great game, where these other guys who it was their first game, they're like, oh, so boring. Nothing happened. And it's like, okay, well, like, if you want to convert new people to keep the fan base alive for the new generations, a lot of these things have to be happening. And so if you have completely like no arguments, nothing going on, that's not as exciting of a product. So with all that being said, I believe in the ABS system, the automated ball strike system, if they can figure that out. But right now what Rob Manfred is saying is that it's not ready, which is fine. Like, if it's not ready, it's not ready. I don't want you to put an imperfect product out there, but it's good enough from what we're hearing from the minor leagues, from what we're seeing from these test groups in the minors. It's good enough to at least like bring it in and say, hey, we can do this on some of the major calls, right? Like, we can at least know that was a terrible call and the ABS system will take care of that one. So here's a few ideas that I have. So number one is one manager challenge per game. Okay. Right now, I think in the minors, it's like, 3 per game. And if you are wrong, then you lose it. If you are right, then you keep it. And it's called by the player, not the manager. I'm talking about a manager challenge per game. So has to be called by the manager. Just like the current challenge system, there is a timing thing with it. So you can't wait more than 5 seconds or 6 seconds. So it has to be kind of like a, let's go, ask right now. Don't look at a replay. Just go with your gut. Call cannot be borderline. So a pitch, just like what you're seeing in some of these replayed pitches when I called them little league strikes, the pitch has to be fully out of the strike zone or fully in the strike zone to be challenged. It can't be touching any of the edges. If it is, then the umpire can veto it and say, no, that's not a challengeable pitch. And there can be something being communicated right from New York or from wherever they get those buzzes on the back of their hips for the challenge or for the pitch clock. Same thing. Like, hey, challenge from the manager. He wants to challenge that ball. Oh, it's a borderline pitch. Buzz. Umpire says, sorry, not a challengeable pitch. Okay, we move on. If it is a challengeable pitch and it is, what JD and Boog would call egregious, right? And I'm calling it little league, then you win that, you keep your challenge. If it's not, if it's very obviously a strike, if it wasn't even borderline, it's just very obviously a strike. It's the opposite. It's not if they're challenging the fact that, hey, I think that was a strike, and it turns out not only was it not a strike, it was completely a ball. It wasn't even touching the borderline. Then you lose your challenge because that was dumb that you thought that was even a ball when it was clearly a strike, or vice versa. So that kind of, keeps the game going. And it doesn't make us go just like, when the challenge system came out for baseball for home runs and for close calls at first base and all this stuff. And we got down to the point where we're like, is a spike touching the base? That wasn't the point of the challenge system to me. That was like, hey, the challenge system is just supposed to overturn the very obvious calls. And now we've gotten to a point where we're like, ooh, I think the tip of his spike is touching the base before the ball is in the glove. And oh, by the way, the ball, it's not touching the leather, but it's considered to be entrapped in the leather, right? Like now we're just getting way too nitty gritty. And that to me wasn't the point of the challenge system. So for the same reason, that's what I'm kind of talking about. If it's a full ball inside or outside of the strike zone, you're able to challenge it. If it's borderline, you're not able to challenge it. And if you're wrong and you said, hey, that was a ball when it was actually a full ball in the strike zone, then you lose your challenge because you're not watching the game close enough. So that to me would be one option. Another option would be a umpire review in leverage situations. Just like the NFL has the 2-minute warning ref reviews, right? It's within 2 minutes. It doesn't matter if you have your challenge or not. If that's a close call, we're going to review it as refs. I think it's the same thing for umpires. So still initiated by the manager. And when I say leverage, I mean 6th inning or later, and there has to be a tying run at the plate. Tying run at the plate, it's the 6th inning or later, it's a close game, and the manager says, there ain't no way you just got that call right. And the umpire can then say, yes, I 100% got that right, because they're buzzing from upstairs and they're saying it's not reviewable, or they're saying, hey, I'm not getting a buzz from upstairs, so yeah, we'll go ahead and review this one. And no matter if you lost your challenge or not, the umpire can say, hey, this is a leverage situation, so I'm going to check it out. And again, the goal is not to go in there and be like, well, it looks like we were an inch off. No, I'm talking about obvious missed calls. If this system is flawed right now, don't go in and try to be pinpoint with this. Try to just eliminate the really bad calls, because, and what I'm talking about, right? This doesn't apply to that Shota pitch against Josh Naylor. It does apply to the pitch that Dansby Swanson had a called strike against him when it was very clearly a ball in Game 3 against the Blue Jays on Sunday. Those are the kinds that I would say, yes, like the ABS system has to be good enough to at least address those kinds of pitches, not the Shota kind of pitch that we saw against Naylor. Let me know your thoughts. Those are the reasonable changes. I have one radical change. This would just blow everyone's mind, I think, but I think I don't know why baseball didn't start this way. Put the freaking home plate umpire behind the pitcher. The home plate umpire, when he is trying to look over, if you're not watching on YouTube right now, I've got my hand under my chin. That's the catcher's head right there. He's trying to look over the catcher's head, and he's trying to keep his head still, and he's got to also look between, 17 inches or whatever the plate is, on one side or the other. That's not a reasonable ask. Right? That's like when you're at a stop sign, right? And you're watching from your car. And you know how your car has a few blind spots and you decide it's time to go, when someone across the street is seeing everything happen and they're like, no, what's that guy doing? Why is he going? Well, that guy across the street didn't have blind spots. Same thing for an umpire. If he's behind the pitcher, he has no blind spots. If he's behind home plate, he has plenty of blind spots. Why don't we just do that? And I know that's crazy, and I know it's no one's ever done that in baseball. Well, guess what? That's the same excuse that Rob Manfred said when he didn't take away the Astros championship, because no one's ever done that before. And all the fans were in an uproar, and all the fans still want the Astros championship pulled away. I'm still talking about it here 7 years later. Why not have that same approach with the umpire behind home plate going to behind the pitcher? That's what I got to say about this whole situation. Long story short, Cubs got screwed this last week. The facts show it, and even if they didn't, they might have been 3-3. Still not good enough. Still not a playoff contending team, in my opinion, if you're going to be playing a bad team like the Blue Jays, and at least coming away with one win from the Guardians is what should have happened. So that's all I got to say about that. I'm going to go put my arm on ice, Setup Nation. Make sure you go and let me know in the comments what you think about everything we just talked about here. And by the way, later this week, I'll be sending out a video about how Seiya Suzuki is always getting screwed on pitches. I want to show you what exactly is going on there, and from the viewpoint that I have and all the film that I've watched, what might be happening to make Seiya the victim of bad umpiring. Make sure you check that out later this week. We'll see you next time.